Call this hearing of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the Senate Committee on Armed Services to order. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today before this subcommittee, and thank you for your service. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the fiscal year 2023 budget of the Space Force, a separate Title X service which was recently authorized in the fiscal year 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. For fiscal year 2023, the Space $0.5 billion, a $7.1 billion or 40% increase over fiscal year 2022. Of the $7.1 billion, however, $3 billion is for inter-service transfers, as the Space Force assumes satellites and people from the Army and Navy, and the remaining $4.1 billion is for programmatic growth, still a 20% increase over fiscal year 2022. I'll be looking to hear what is being transferred into the Space Force, especially with the transfer of uniformed Army and Navy personnel. The administration has submitted a proposal for a new personnel system that would treat Space Force Guardians as either full or part-time components. The reserves would fall into the part-time component, and I want to know more about this given competing proposals for a Space National Guard. Finally, since the Space Force is a Title X service, its purpose is to train and equip Guardians to defend our assets in space, which is now a warfighting domain given the action of Russia and China against our satellites. I will want to know how our policy is developing to defend our space assets, and if necessary, ensure a near-peer adversary space systems cannot be used to help assist an attack on our forces on the ground or at sea during a conflict. Again, let me thank our witnesses for agreeing to appear today, and after opening statements, we will have a 5-minute round of questions to the witnesses. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator King. I join you in welcoming our witnesses. Thank you all for being here with us today and for the work that you do on behalf of this nation. Dr. Plumb, it's good to see you again. I understand you will be testifying before this panel again next week. 3 times in a row, that has to be some kind of record. We appreciate your service, sir, and we look forward to hearing from you and the other witnesses today about the continued evolution of the department's national security space enterprise. It's been 2.5 years since the founding of the Space Force. We welcome the panel's views on what progress has been made, particularly toward developing an acquisition system that delivers capabilities on a timeline that is responsive to the needs of our warfighters and paces the actions of our adversaries. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Our witnesses today are Mr. Frank Calvelli, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Dr. John Plumb, welcome back, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and General David D. Thompson, Vice Chief of Space Operations, United States Space Force. So, Mr. Frank Calvelli.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it is an honor to appear before you to discuss the future of space acquisition. Thank you for asking me to testify. I am excited to join the department and for this important work to come as we optimize space acquisition. As you know, we must do more and quickly to accelerate and improve space acquisition. Our adversaries are catching up, or in some cases exceeding our capabilities. Strong partnerships between the department, Congress, and the commercial industry are critical to outpace China and other adversaries. As I step into this new role, I would like to share with you my initial goals and priorities. These include 1, driving speed into our acquisitions in order to deliver new capabilities faster, to outpace our adversaries and maintain the technological advantage we get as a nation from space. 2, making our space architectures more resilient so that it can be counted on during times of crisis and conflict. 3, integrating our space architecture with other warfighting domains to give our warfighters a strategic edge. 4, driving program management discipline across our acquisitions in order to ensure that we deliver new capabilities on schedule, on cost, and meeting requirements. And 5, ensuring that our space and ground systems come together as a system and that our ground systems are more readily available before launch to take advantage of new capabilities that we just put into space. I look forward to working with you over the coming months to continue the strong partnership between the Department and the Congress to optimize and strengthen space acquisition processes and outcomes, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Dr. Plumb.
Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, members of the subcommittee. Appreciate the opportunity to testify today and get my frequent flyer miles. As the first ever Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, I am committed to continuing DOD's close partnership with Congress on advancing national security space interests. Space plays a critical role in American security, prosperity, and way of life. It enables and supports the entire joint force. It helps protect service members in harm's way, and it enables them to execute their mission and defend the nation. Space provides indication and warning of emerging threats and attacks. It delivers the GPS signals supporting rapid and precise global power projection. It generates intelligence to allow national decision makers to anticipate risks and de-escalate crises, and enables those same decision makers to command and control forces globally. And the tremendous growth of commercial space, largely due to U.S. business innovation, is fueling an increasing important part of the U.S. economy. The growth of the U.S. space industrial base affords DOD new opportunities to leverage commercial advancements to support national security. And space is once again capturing the imagination of a new generation of Americans. This will inspire more students to pursue careers into the STEM disciplines, and that will pay dividends to our national economy and national security in the future. Looking at the threat environment, China and Russia both seek to increase their military use of space and to exploit the perceived U.S. over-reliance on space-based systems. China remains our pacing challenge, as Secretary Austin has said. They are developing and fielding a wartime space architecture. China has dramatically increased their quantity and quality of space and counterspace systems, including ground and space-based anti-satellite weapons to target U.S. and allied satellites. Russia maintains a large network of reconnaissance, communication, and navigation satellites, and they also are developing, testing, and fielding counterspace weapons, including ground-based and on-orbit capabilities to target U.S. and allied satellites. These threats require the U.S. to consider new approaches to ensuring our use of space, including developing more proliferated and therefore more resilient constellations. So to that end, the President's FY23 budget request seeks $27.6 billion for DoD space capabilities, including $4.7 billion to fund the transition to a new resilient missile warning and missile track architecture, $1.8 billion to procure 2 GPS-3 follow-on satellites and to continue testing and integration of military GPS user equipment, $1.6 billion for secure, survivable, and jam-resistant SATCOM, and $1.6 billion to procure 6 national security space launch vehicles. In November, Russia conducted an irresponsible, destructive test of a direct-ascent ASAT missile, creating more than 1,500 pieces of trackable debris, hundreds of thousands of smaller pieces that threaten safe space operations in low Earth orbit. In contrast, the Department is committed to promoting norms of responsible behavior in space to ensure the space domain remains secure, stable, and accessible. The Deputy Secretary of Defense stated in December at the National Space Council meeting that the Department would like to see all nations agree to refrain from anti-satellite weapons testing that create debris. And at Vandenberg last month, Vice President Harris announced a U.S. commitment that the U.S. will not conduct destructive direct-ascent ASAT missile testing. These types of tests jeopardize the long-term sustainability and safety of space for all. This includes human spaceflight programs and all commercial satellite operators. Ending destructive direct-ascent ASAT missile tests is therefore in our national security interest and our national economic interest. The U.S. has demonstrated leadership with this commitment and encourages all nations to support responsible space behaviors. So in conclusion, the threats facing the U.S. in space and from space continue to grow in both quantity and quality. Countering those threats requires that we continue this long-standing bipartisan cooperation between DOD and the Congress. I'm committed to sustaining those efforts, and I'm honored to work with this committee to do so. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
General Thompson.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Fisher, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It's an honor to appear before you on behalf of the Secretary of the Air Force, the Honorable Frank Kendall, the Chief of Space Operations, General Jay Raymond, and the 14,000 Guardians around the world executing our space missions today. U.S. military success in great power competition depends on access to and freedom to operate in space, while denying the same to our adversaries. In 2019, Congress established a Space Force to organize, train, equip, and present forces to deter hostile action and protect U.S. interests in space, and to secure the domain for stable, peaceful use. Space capabilities are a cornerstone of integrated deterrence, not just in space, but in every domain. And those space capabilities that we operate underpin every aspect of our national security. At the same time, our space systems and use of the domain remain under threat by competitor nations. China remains our pacing challenge. In 2021, the PRC continued to accelerate the integration of space capabilities into its military operations, especially space-based surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance, which puts the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines we protect and support at great risk. Additionally, Russia's overarching strategy remains to challenge the U.S. in space. That is unchanged for decades. It is continuing to improve its military space capabilities as well. Both nations are also developing and deploying an array of kinetic and non-kinetic counterspace weapons that threaten U.S. systems in every orbital regime, on the ground, and in cyberspace. In response to these challenges, and in keeping with the reason the Space Force was established, we continue to make substantial progress in the design, development, and fielding of space capabilities that maintain our freedom to operate in space. We advance recruiting, training, and educating the workforce that's demanded to operate in such a highly technical domain, and in putting in place the intelligence, analytic, and test foundations that ensure success of our forces in future conflict. The President's fiscal year 2023 budget request for the Space Force does this in several ways. As examples, it initiates the first major transformation to a resilient force structure with a proliferated missile warning, missile tracking architecture, which is also capable of tracking hypersonic and maneuvering vehicles. It enhances our awareness of all activities in space and the ability to command and control forces in this increasingly dynamic domain. It begins the build-out of an operational test and training infrastructure that will generate the military readiness appropriate to the challenges we face, and it allows us to assume full authority for the preparation, training, and management of the 14,000 Guardians, who are the Space Force's greatest asset and its primary instrument. I look forward to discussing these and many other aspects of our request in more detail with you in today's hearing and as we partner in the coming months. Your support and enactment of the fiscal year 2023 Defense Authorization Bill will enable the Space Force to remain the world's leader in space and to continue to preserve freedom of action for the nation. Thank you for your continued advocacy and support. We're eager to work with your committee to build the strategy and make the investments needed to secure our nation's vital interests.
Thank you. The first point I want to make is that we're in the process now of putting together the National Defense Authorization Act for this year, literally in a matter of where paperwork is moving. So we're talking about a matter of weeks. To the extent any of you or the Secretary has, or the Commanding General have suggestions or needs or thoughts about authorities or modifications to current statute as you have grown into this new force, please let us know as soon as possible, so that we might consider those as amendments or as proposals in this year's National Defense Act. So I hope you'll consider that an open invitation. And the other way to put it is, don't complain next summer when you didn't get what you want if you don't tell us what you need. Dr. Plumb, Section 1602 of the 2022 Act requires the Secretary of Defense to designate the Chief of Space Operations as the force design architect for the space systems by March of this year, 2022. This is important. We give the same designation to the Chief of Naval Operations for the fleet at sea and the Chief of the Air Force for planes in the air. During our Air Force posture hearing, Senator Reid asked the Chief of Space Operations whether this designation had occurred, and he said it was still residing in the Office of the Secretary of Defense Space Policy. Why has this not occurred, and when will it occur?
Thank you, Senator. I have spoken with General Raymond about that, and I've spoken with your staff about this. So I was really alerted to this just last week. I immediately took it to my office, so my office is now responsible for it. I have initiated conversations with OGC, Office of General Counsel, on getting this right. I will get that done. It is a little bit new because it has all space systems in it, but we will get that designation done. I will point out that I think functionally speaking, and General Thompson may want to weigh in, but that functionally speaking, I believe that the CSO is the force design architect at this point, but that's not the same as formalizing it as you've asked. So I will do that. It will take a little bit of time to get it through the building.
Well, I hope a little bit of time is measured in weeks and not months.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is a somewhat difficult situation because we're talking about some things that are public and a lot of things that aren't, and we have to be careful in our discussion. But as your testimony indicates, we know that both China and Russia, A, are establishing a major presence in space, B, are establishing a capability to hold our satellites and our space assets at risk. Insofar as you can testify in an open session, please outline our strategy, if you will, for protecting our assets and dealing with what is now a highly contested domain, which wasn't the case until pretty recently. Mr. General?
Senator, I'll outline that, I'll say, in three primary points today. The first element of the strategy is to fully and deeply understand all of the activities and in the domain, what objects are out there, the things that they do, their capabilities, whether or not they pose a threat to us, our capabilities and our assets, the capabilities, techniques, tactics, doctrine that might be used in their employment, and to be able to ensure we have indications and warnings should an attack be coming. And a lot of the investment in our budget and the work that we have been doing to date creates the space domain awareness, infrastructure, and architecture that we need to do that. The second thing is many of the space systems that are on orbit today and will be for years to come were not designed to operate in a domain like this and under threat. However, there are things that we can and are doing to them to increase their ability to be defended and to contribute to their own defense. Things like ensuring that additional fuel remains on board in case we need to maneuver, looking at ways to make them more difficult targets to track and ultimately to attack. And let's just say in this setting, other systems, other capabilities, and other tactics that will make them more difficult to attack and destroy should an adversary attempt to do so. And the third major component of our strategy is to create those resilient architectures going forward that are much harder, that are survivable by design and less vulnerable in terms of attack. And the primary mechanism by which we do that, and we intend to do that, is rather than architectures today that are consist of a relatively small number of very capable, very sophisticated satellites, building architectures with larger numbers of less capable, less expensive satellites that in aggregate give us the same capability. And in fact, in this budget, our request for the missile warning, missile tracking architecture that we have proposed is the first major step for the architectures in that regard. So in this setting, those are the three major points of making us more defendable and more resilient in space.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Thompson, I appreciate the Space Force's effort to pivot towards proliferated satellite architectures, the resilient missile warning, missile tracking program that I discussed with General Raymond at the full committee hearing last week is but one example of that. I agree with the conceptual advantages distributed architectures provide, but how ready is the industrial base to meet production needs associated with those much larger constellations?
Madam Senator, I would say that it is probably as ready as it has been in the last several decades, and for several reasons. One is we've maintained some sort of capability in terms of the production of our current satellites and some of the investments in technology and prototyping. But a great portion of the industrial base is expanding because of commercial investment. And while there are some specific aspects of military and national security space systems that don't lend themselves to commercial investment, a vast majority of the operating techniques, the subsystems used would apply both to commercial investment and to military and national security investment as well. So while there are some very specific niche capabilities that we have pursued and we have maintained with competition in various aspects, I think the investment we're seeing in commercial space has served all of us well in creating a more robust and more capable industrial base to address our space needs.
Do you see limitations or bottlenecks on certain things like refrigeration units, for example?
I would say there are a few very boutique capabilities for which we probably have a few bottlenecks. Some of the sophisticated sensors that we use, the sensor elements and those aspects of them we do. But generally speaking, when you think about the subsystems on board a spacecraft, whether it's power subsystems, propulsion subsystems, attitude control, generally speaking, there are not bottlenecks in that regard. But there are, for some of the very specialized capabilities and specialized technologies, there are a few.
You don't find that a limitation?
I would say it is, but I cannot point specifically today to any space system whose development is being held up due to the lack of the readiness of a capability or a provider for those capabilities.
When the Space Force is looking at architecture design, is there a process through which it takes industrial-based limitations into account so that we don't produce plans that are technically sound but not feasible?
Yes, ma'am, there is. And really what happens is, and it's part of a long-standing process, but part of our new process. One of the new processes that we created in our Space Warfighting Analysis Center was to bring in industry early in any force design activity that we are performing, providing them with our requirements, our design concepts, the results of our analysis as to how, in fact, we intend to accomplish missions, provide them with all of that data, and ask them to provide input directly or come back later after the fact. That's one point in time in which we can have the conversation about whether the technology is there. But the second point is when we then take those designs and hand them over to Mr. Calvelli and the acquisition team, that's where they truly begin the extensive review of all the expected technologies, and as part of the system acquisition process, determine whether the technology is available, whether it's ready, whether there's risk reduction and prototyping work that needs to be required, and assess the risk and effort required to either deliver the system or come back and say, unfortunately, the technology is probably too risky to pursue at that point.
Did you have anything, Mr. Secretary, you wanted to add to that?
No, I think General Thompson nailed it really well. And you're right, ma'am. You don't want to start down an acquisition that you can't execute because of the supply chain or technology issues. So you got to take a really close look up front and make sure whatever you're going to decide to put out in a request for proposal and then put under contract is something that you actually can achieve.
You know, we have to meet the needs of combatant commanders, at STRATCOM especially, and there has been, I would say, some questions raised on the ability to meet those needs and what is needed as a resource to do that. So thank you.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Secretary, from where I sit on this committee and the Intelligence Committee, it seems like the NRO has been slightly more successful in delivering space capabilities in a timely and efficient fashion. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experiences there and what your plans are to help replicate that success in the department?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. The NRO has a culture of program management discipline. It's inherent in its DNA that we expect our program managers to understand technically their programs, to understand their contracts, and to deliver on cost, on schedule, and meeting the requirements. From my position where I was at as the deputy there and the director, working with the director, we always sort of oversaw and made sure that culture continued, and we managed our programs. We managed our program element officers and our program managers to deliver. I mean, so that became just part of the culture over the last decade or so that, it's really important that you hit your plan. The other thing is, we learned some things about making sure that when we put proposals out there, that we really get realistic cost proposals back and realistic schedules, especially in a competitive environment. And that's really a key to ensure that you have that so that whatever they're delivering to you is actually going to be executable. And when you review proposals, to make sure that you put in place the right contract strategy, the right contract incentives that are going to incentivize success.
Okay. General Thompson, what do you think about that?
Mr. Senator, I would agree. I've got some experience not on the acquisition side, but in the operational side of the NRO. And it really is that aspect of discipline in the execution of a program from start to finish, and the tendency not to decide that each successive article needs to improve in capability, but rather to provide consistent expectations up front and throughout the schedule that makes it important.
Okay. One interesting note from the war in Ukraine is that most people assess that Ukraine's communications or internet access would be cut off in the first days, probably really the first hours of the war. That did not happen. It still has not happened. I think that's in part based on satellite-based internet. What lessons have we learned about what we can do should we ever face a similar conflict with Russia and China, where they're trying to deny us that?
I think the one lesson that I've seen is that by adding and integrating in commercial capabilities, that you're going to diversify your architecture and make it much more resilient. And so that's really been a great piece of the puzzle to actually watch happen, how commercial technology, commercial capability has added resiliency along the way.
And I would add to that I think what we're seeing as a result of their ability to be prevented from using space capabilities is also a reflection of these new proliferated architectures that are very difficult to deny overall. You may be able to deny a piece of it, but you can't eliminate the capability writ large. And as we look, we're beginning a new force design activity to look at the future of space-based communications and data relay, not only bringing in commercial capability, but absolutely that proliferated architecture that makes a network that's very difficult to defeat in total is another element of what I think we're learning from Ukraine.
All right. Mr. Plumb, any thoughts on that?
Yes, Senator. I just add, I think this is a really good example of resilience means different things for different constellations and functions. So for ISR, or for missile warning, missile track, that's a proliferated set of orbits with IR sensors. But SATCOM in particular, on your question, there's a lot of commercial capacity. There's more coming, and using that as a totally different approach to get to the same end, which is resilience. I think it's really important.
All right, thank you. General Thompson, the budget brief highlights a $36 million investment in climate initiatives. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, sir. Two things. First of all, it is really a matter of understanding our base infrastructure, the facilities, the power infrastructure. Most of our space capabilities are operated from home station. They operate 24/7. They have to operate in peacetime and wartime. And most of that is focused on ensuring that the power systems and the means by which our bases operate under all conditions can be sustained regardless of peacetime, conflict, climate conditions, and things like that. That's part of it. The second aspect is we do own part of the weather and meteorological mission for the Department of Defense and the nation, and part of that investment includes our space-based environmental monitoring and some of the tools and techniques that we use to do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, first of all, thank you for your continued service to our country. Mr. Calvelli, massive amounts of data are sent and received through space every second. In order to maintain our technological edge, integration of artificial intelligence and quantum computing will be necessary to process all of this data in a timely manner. What are your thoughts on how we acquire this type of capability? And General Thompson, to the extent that you can in this open session, can you describe and assess what our adversaries, specifically China, are doing in these areas? Mr. Calvelli?
I think one of the challenges on the AI front is making sure that our data is accessible by algorithms down the road. And so we've had a lot of historic of closed architectures. What you really want to do is make sure your ground systems are open, that your data is exposed through application programming interfaces, and that future algorithms, whether that be machine learning algorithms or AI algorithms, actually can access the data. I think that's going to be one of the biggest keys, getting the data accessed. As far as quantum computing go, we're really, as a nation, I believe, in the research and development stage of that, and I think that the nation needs to continue that. I honestly don't know what sort of the role of the services in that area, but I do believe that we need to, as a country, really spend money and foster the ability for this nation to develop quantum techniques It's going to drive a whole world of encryption down the road and high-speed processing that I think we want to stay the lead in as a nation.
If I could, just to clarify, because when we talk about this, I think people kind of pull everything together on it. AI is here, and it's being integrated now. Fair to say?
Yes, I agree.
Thank you. General Thompson.
Senator, just a few comments in regard of Russia and China, and I will say primarily China, but it applies to Russia as well. I would argue that while the creativity and ingenuity and energy in our academic and commercial sector is tremendous, and in many cases our asymmetric advantage, the Chinese for sure have a plan and an expectation to lead the world in AI by 2030. They have made that public. They are making great advances, in some cases on their own, in some cases because many of their scientists and engineers study in American universities. So they have a plan to outpace us in that regard, and they are certainly a capable adversary. So I'd say this is absolutely an area of competition that we need to expect and be attentive to in the years to come.
Thank you, General. I just want to follow up on that because I think the next step on this is talking about the other areas. We've been competing against our adversaries in air, land, sea, cyberspace, and now we see them most certainly challenging us in space. Both China and Russia have conducted anti-satellite operations and have weaponized space. I mean weaponized space in an attempt to deter and counter U.S. effectiveness in space. To the level that you can in this open forum, can you describe the threats our adversaries are posing to us in space, and do you have the authorities and resources needed to be able to respond to these threats? The reason why I bring it up once again is as the chairman of the committee has indicated, if we need to make policy changes to respond, now is the time to get that out, or we're going to end up waiting another year.
In terms of their capabilities, in fact, we've become much better at declassifying and communicating those capabilities in an unclassified sense. I said in my opening statement that they can threaten us kinetically and non-kinetically in every domain. As you referenced, the Russians conducted a destructive anti-satellite missile test in November 2021. The Chinese did that in 2007. They've been rapidly building capabilities ever since. Both have on-orbit capabilities that attack our satellites directly. Both also have multiple ways to attack us through cyberspace, laser dazzling on RF. And so I would say absolutely, they can threaten us in every regime and by every means available.
What would be your response, General, to those that may say that space is not or should not be thought of as a war-fighting domain?
Yeah. Senator, I would say that, first of all, Russia and China have voted, and they have already decided that it is. And our primary purpose as the Space Force is to ensure we can deter them from making it a true domain of conflict in the direct sense. And if not, should they go to that, it's our job to ensure that we can continue to operate effectively in space regardless.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And now I want to call on the only person in this room who's ever been to space, Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do miss it. I wasn't going to say that. No, but it's great to have the opportunity to serve again in a different role. General Thompson, I got a question about the Space National Guard. So, and this topic came up at last week's Air Force posture hearing. And I understand that currently the National Guard's space capability is organized in 17 units across 7 states and Guam, and is made up of nearly 1,500 airmen, or 15% of the Space Force. And as General Raymond mentioned last week, the National Guard has been involved in the space mission for 25 years. When asked about the prospect of a Space National Guard last week, General Raymond indicated that there are 2 ways to ensure that we maintain that capability. One was to either have a separate Space National Guard, and the other was to take the capabilities from the Guard and move them into one combined active duty and reserve component. Now, that second option assumes that current Air National Guard members will transfer to the Space Force under a mixed full-time, part-time, active component model. This ignores the fact that many folks who joined the Air National Guard, they did so because of geographic stability that it offers the members and their families, as well as the opportunity sometimes to serve their state. So, General Thompson, what are your thoughts on the advantages of establishing a Space National Guard? And to your knowledge, is the Department of the Air Force assuming that those nearly 1,500 Guardsmen would transfer into a combined active duty and reserve component if we did take that approach?
Senator, you certainly characterized the current state and situation very well. The Guard has served effectively in the Air Guard beside Space Forces at the time, the United States Air Force for decades. We cannot do without the capability and missions that they provide today moving into the future. And so if, in fact, we do not create a Space National Guard, and as you stated, the administration has come out with a statement of policy to say that we do not want to create a Space Guard, we do have to do that assessment and ultimately planning in preparation to move those forces. We are doing an assessment right now of that. We do not make the assumption that any number of Guard members will make that transition. That option would certainly be presented to them if it came to that point. We are making no assumptions about whether those members would accept or desire that transfer or not. We are certainly, as part of our assessment, determining what would be required to replace those members by Space Force members, the numbers it would take, the training time it would take, the training resources it would take, and the corresponding degradation in mission as we bring those units back up to full status. So there are some that think that a large number of Guard members may transition. There are others that don't believe that's the case. In our current assessment, we are not making the assumption that a large number of Guard members would transition.
And when do you think you'll have this evaluation analysis done?
Sir, it is ongoing at this time. We anticipate that it will be done in time to support the next budget request.
Okay, thank you. Another quick question, General, about, in my remaining time, about space debris. My understanding is that the Space Surveillance Network is currently tracking over 25,000 objects. So does that mean you have a state vector on 25,000 objects, and how small can you currently track something?
Yes, sir. The updated number is now approaching 40,000 objects.
40,000.
And that is correct. We have what we call custody, which is a state vector that is updated routinely, and we reliably track objects down to about 10 square centimeters in radar cross-section. So if you made a fist the size of your fist or perhaps a tennis ball, that is the size of the object we can track reliably. I will say even conservative estimates say there are probably at least 10 times as many other objects that are smaller than in space that we cannot track reliably.
So that 40,000 number presumably would go up, not necessarily because there are more debris objects populating LEO, but just that you're finding more. Is that accurate?
It could if, in fact, we had more advanced sensors that had the ability to reliably track smaller and smaller objects.
How often do you find yourself, looking for something and despite having the state vector, you no longer can find it?
Senator, I would say that we encounter hundreds to thousands of objects a day that we need to go back and decide what the state vector is. And that's because they are in odd orbits. They are on the edge of being large enough or small enough, and in some cases, because of their size and shape, operate unlike most of the objects in orbit, which is to say not in a Keplerian manner, as you understand.
All right, well, let's work together to continue to refine this, because as these number of objects go up, I think we're going to need, better capability, because it just puts our assets and those of our allies at risk.
Yes, sir, and referring back to the last question, this is a perfect application for AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning as well, to help us with that problem.
All right, thank you, General.
Senator Chubberville.
Thank you very much. Just follow up on that. One satellite is destroyed. How many pieces, basically, on average, would come from one satellite, average satellite?
Senator, it depends on method. When the Chinese destroyed their test satellite in 2007,
Completely destroyed, right?
Completely destroyed. They created over 3,700 pieces of debris that we could track. And again, there are large, perhaps 10 times as many smaller pieces we could not. The Russians...
Which was last year, right?
The Russians last year created more than 1,500 pieces of debris that we're currently tracking. So it depends on, in many cases, exactly what, but you're talking about thousands of pieces of debris with a kinetic destruction.
So that's going to be a huge, huge problem in the future, correct? If they continue to
So I would say,
test missiles.
yeah, that's right. In fact, that's one of the reasons for the tenets for responsible behavior that were released by the Secretary of Defense last year, and the statement made by the administration about destructive ASAT testing.
And they're there forever, right?
Not quite forever, but for years to decades, certainly, depending on the orbital regime.
Our lifetime.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. This is kind of for all of you. You know, very simple. What would you say is the most successful aspect of the National Security Space Launch Program? What's the most successful thing that we've done?
Thank you, Senator. I think that the ability to do, one, make sure we've got the two providers, and do these things in block buys. It seems to be driving down costs. We were just talking about this before the hearing, and it provides some stability to those contractors. So I think it's it looks like a success from where I sit.
Is the cost going down or up as we speak? I know
I feel like my acquisition colleague should answer that, if that's all right, sir.
So I know what I would say is that over the life of the program, based on the previous approach to launch and what we pursue today in the National Security Space Launch Program, we believe we have saved over $7 billion in terms of what we would have paid using the past program. And I will tell you, based on the current growth in the commercial launch industry, in recent years, the addition of that competition is helping to drive costs down and may very well drive them further down in the future.
We couldn't make it without the commercial people, could we? Or would it be very expensive?
No question it would be more expensive without commercial providers.
Yeah, I would answer that by saying having two distinct companies providing launch services, I think, is great for the nation. The more, the merrier.
Yeah.
Senator, if I may,
Go ahead.
The
You
most,
get your chance, yeah.
So the Major D.T. Thompson was the investigating officer on the last National Security Space Launch accident in 1999. And I will tell you, one launch at a time for almost 100 national security launches and more, mission success in every one of those launches is the most important factor of the National Security Space Launch Squadron or program for 22 years.
Mr. Calvelli, as a transition from the single launch procurement awards to block buys reduced the price of space launch? Has it reduced it?
So I don't know specifically on NSSL, but my understanding in general of spaces, when you do things in a block, it does help you to reduce the cost, yes.
General?
Yes, Senator, absolutely.
Absolutely.
As the department considers the next launch procurement contract, what new requirements will be included to ensure the U.S. beats China and Russia efforts to impact our space capabilities? Either one, anybody?
Yeah, Senator, in terms of new requirements from an operational sense, right now the answer is not many significantly in this specific sector. We still have the same sorts of reference missions and payload designs that we need in this phase, where I'll tell you the new opportunities and new requirements are in a couple of areas. The first is in smaller and responsive launch to deal with things like the potential rapid replenishment of capabilities is one area of potential growth. The second is, as we see a lot of interest and energy in on-orbit servicing and maneuver. And so an approach that not only launches these satellites to orbit, but perhaps moves them around in orbit, refuels them, replenishes them. Those are a couple of areas of what I'll call the space launch enterprise that are growing. Specifically related to national security space launch in phase 3, very similar in terms of the requirements for the next phase.
Yeah, thank you. I was excited about seeing the IG report yesterday. Moving a little bit closer possibly to get Space Command to Redstone Arsenal. And, you know, we're military friendly and look forward to that possibly happening. Thank y'all. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that advertisement for the state of Alabama. Senator Kramer.
There's nothing wrong with advocating for the hometown, as long as there aren't too many of you. No, it's all good. Thanks, you guys, for being here, for your service. Thanks for this morning's briefing as well. It was really important, and it was interesting, you know, at least the parts I understood, and I was encouraged. So thank you. Secretary Calvelli and General Thompson, I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics under your direct command. That's, of course, the Parks Radar facility at Calvelli. And I did ask General Raymond and General Brown about this last week. You might have heard that or watched it. If not, I'm going to ask you the same question anyway. I noticed that it's not funded for in the budget, the modernization. And I brought it up because I'm concerned because this year's budget documents say that this radar has a, quote, high risk that equipment failures will cause unacceptable mission downtime. And I don't want that to happen. I don't think you want that to happen. It is a 50-year-old radar that's doing important work. And I know there's an analog to digital modernization effort that the program office is looking at, and General Raymond told us the Space Force would address the parks issue in the coming budget years. I just want to make sure you're aware of the precarious situation that Calvelli seems to be in, and do you agree that this important 50-year technology needs a complete overhaul, if not this year, soon? Each of you. If you want to speak to Parks Radar in general, that'd be fine.
Yes, sir, Senator. I will absolutely say, first of all, it does fill a critical role in our missile warning enterprise today. Part of the assessment, and we need to sustain it for that role into the future. Part of what we're looking at in that regard as well is, as we look at advancing threats, as we look at hyperglide vehicles, as we look at fractional orbital bombardment systems and the ability to basically fly around the South Pole to be able to attack the United States, we're in the process of understanding what the future missile warning and missile defense or tracking architecture needs to look like, and the role that parks may play in that. We're still doing that assessment, but certainly in the near term must be sustained. The other thing I'll say is, and it's some of the discussion I had with Senator Kelly, it plays a vital role in space surveillance today as well, and we need to ensure that that capability remains.
All right. Thank you. I want to spend a little time now on SDA, because I know that we're at that moment here in a few months when it gets rolled in, when we set up Space Force. Of course, one of the goals was, and you all are doing well at it, is streamlining acquisition, obviously speeding up R&D, all of those important things that you're here to talk about. But SDA, when we stood that up in 2021, it really, we were noting the importance of this and of developing, preserving really an independent culture, which I think is best for innovation. So now once it gets rolled in, maybe you guys could help me understand your commitment to that SDA will preserve at least some of its independence and autonomy while it also does important work for you and the Joint Force, of course. If you have a sense of how that might be managed, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, actually, you're thinking along the same way I am. I'm excited about SDA coming on board. I think they're doing some really neat stuff with their proliferated LEO system in Tranche 1 for the communication satellites. I think it's going to add new capabilities quickly because they're doing things on 2-year centers. I think it's going to add resiliency to the architecture. I like their culture. I'm looking forward to them coming on board, and I don't see any major changes in terms of how they do business or their culture.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Continuing along that topic then for a moment in their culture of innovation and rapid acquisition, MTA, middle tier acquisition pathway, was designed to facilitate rapid prototyping and fielding of new threat-driven capabilities in timeframes not met by the traditional requirements process. Do you support granting SDA middle tier acquisition authority so that they can continue to move fast then?
Yeah, from what I've seen, I think on the Space Force side, there's about 8 or 9 programs that are using 804 authorities. It's allowed them to go a little bit quicker. We talked earlier about the fact that speed is really what this nation needs, and so yes, I would support them having 804 authorities.
Well, maybe since you're on such a roll, and I'm tracking with you, man, maybe talk a little bit more about the procurement enterprise and the reorganization and how you see that playing out. So we can, I always like to say move at the speed of China. I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it or not, but I just know we need to be fast. Yeah, so I'm still getting my arms around it. And so clearly, and under my portfolio now is Space Systems Command. Then you have SDA coming on board on October 1st, and then you've got Space RCO.
You know, all three are unique in their own way, and all three have sort of their own unique characteristics. I am not a big proponent of reorgs. I just think they're boring, they're messy, and they get nothing accomplished. So I'm looking forward to actually having these three separate elements in the portfolio and make sure they have the authorities, responsibilities, and we have the right things in place to go ahead and gain that speed and take advantage of each one's distinct strengths.
Well, Secretary Plumb, I'm out of time, but I was going to ask you basically the same question about cyber and probably the role of commercial and the integration of all of that. If you have a quick answer or just as thought, that'd be helpful.
You know, Senator, I think that the cyber piece here, if that's what you're asking, is really important, and I don't think we fully have our hands around it. Defense in depth for satellite architecture is hard, for ground stations is hard, and I'm in a lot of meetings about this where we have to break through this idea that there's just a defensive perimeter, and people know this now, but getting to this is a journey.
Well, be open with us as into how we can help, whether it's a policy issue or an oversight issue, or because we need, we need that culture cultivated. But thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll have a second round. Senator Fisher. A very practical question. I've heard the word GPS mentioned maybe 6 or 8 times so far this afternoon. What if you're in an F-35 in a conflict situation 35,000 feet above the Pacific and GPS goes off? What is that pilot able to do? General?
Senator, I need to be careful because I'm neither a pilot nor that familiar with the F-35, but I will tell you absolutely there are concerns with many of our systems today and their inability to navigate effectively over the long term with GPS denial. Now, obviously, we do train. In fact, before I left the Air Force and transitioned to the Space Force, we do train our pilots and their systems in a GPS denied environment and how to respond. And so their ability to aviate and fly safely is generally assured, but obviously there's likely to be a mission impact. But it does absolutely go to your point that while GPS is the world standard, it is perhaps not fair to say that we've come to rely on it solely and exclusively and too heavily. And certainly within the department, there are activities ongoing to augment it, to supplement it, to provide additional means of being able to navigate and position and conduct missions.
I would think that would be a high priority. I remember several years ago hearing that Annapolis was going back to teaching celestial navigation, but I understand they really aren't, that they're talking about it, but they haven't really done it. But somebody's got to be thinking about this, because in a conflict, if I'm the adversary, the first thing I'm going to do is try to knock out GPS in order to blind us.
Senator, inside all of the services, especially inside the Army, is probably leading right now. The Navy is not far behind, but the Air Force as well. They're looking at a host of technologies and methodologies for positioning and navigation. The one that you specifically referred to, in fact, they're developing techniques for celestial navigation automatically without a navigator, a human navigator required.
There's got to be a way to automate a sextant.
Yes, sir, absolutely. And frankly, to be able to do it in daylight when the human eye can't see stars. There's technology in that regard. Many years ago, onboard navigation, inertial navigation systems were the way we conducted business in the 50s and 60s before GPS was rampant. It's time to reinvest in those technologies and those capabilities, I think, to advance them. There's even techniques that allow systems to measure the magnetic field of the Earth, and based on the variations in the Earth magnetic field, figure out where you are, terrain mapping. There are a lot of ways to solve this problem, and I would say probably inside the Department of Defense, I think we finally have enough people who have woken up to the fact that GPS is the world standard, will remain the world standard for a long time, but we have to be prepared for those who wish to deny us GPS in operation to be able to fight through it effectively.
Thank you. I appreciate that and hope that is an urgent consideration. Mr. Plumb, you mentioned, Dr. Plumb, in your testimony, you said something, touched on international discussions, international negotiations. How is that going? Is that real? Is there any interest? I mean, this strikes me as an area where we could have a space version of UNCLOS. Not that we could get that through the Senate, but
That is, I will leave that joke on the table.
Yeah.
But Senator,
I should've.
so actually, the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group is just meeting. I will just point out that Canada has joined us in their commitment to not conduct destructive ASAT testing, which is one small piece of this. There are several other like-minded nations in support. Our goal there is a fewfold. One is to go in with an open mind and welcome ideas on ways to increase transparency and ensure a stable space environment. The fact that these discussions are ongoing and looking at a way to both build norms and hopefully keep debris mitigation standards enforced. Right now we have UN mitigation guidelines, but not everyone follows them. There's quite a bit going on. We're right at the beginning of it, but I think there's value and there's momentum. I do think the Vice President's announcement gave us a little bit of a kickstart, which helps too.
Final question. Is there systematic coordination? And by that I mean an organized council or some body that does the coordination between Space Force, NRO, NASA? I mean, I just worry that there may well be duplication and overlap in terms of launch and satellite development. I'd hate to, I mean, I know from the Intelligence Committee we spend a lot of money with NRO on satellites, and I would hope that there would be coordination so that we're not duplicating.
Actually, there is. From my time at the NRO, there actually used to be, and I think there still is, quarterly meetings with NRO, NASA, and the Air Force now the Space Force, just to make sure that they do coordinate and understand what each one is working on. So there's actually a pretty tight relationship across all three of those organizations. And inside the Space Force, there's the Space Acquisition Council that this committee put in place that helps to integrate across all the services across the Pentagon for space features. And then SSC and other teams have a lower-level council called the Program Integration Council that does the same as well. So there's actually, sir, a lot of teamwork going on across the community for space.
Good. Thank you. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Plumb, Section 1609 of last year's NDAA required the department to review the classification level of space programs to determine whether they could be reduced or declassified, and it's my understanding that you're leading this effort. Can you update us on the status, please?
Yes, thanks, Senator, for this opportunity. So I have been looking at that. My team has been looking at it. I've been looking at it with General Raymond's staff. That is an enormous tasking. It is far beyond any 90-day deadline. I think fundamentally the place I am going on this, and I'm speaking for myself here, not the department yet, is that probably all of those things, the hundreds and hundreds of things that are classified for the Space Force are probably appropriately classified. And the fundamental question is, does a classification guide need to be redone, which is sort of a follow-on task. So I'll be working with you in this committee as well as on the House side to try to find the right way forward to make this scoped correctly, and if that's the test we need to get addressed, then we need to get to that.
Are there any efforts being made to declassify threat information that we receive?
So that, of course, is not that 1609 piece, but it is important. I will note that DNI Haynes' annual threat assessment that I think she was on the Hill yesterday on it, it's stamped February, but I just saw a copy of it yesterday. So does go farther than I think previous things on both, as General Thompson has been pointing out as well. China and Russia both have on-orbit and ground-based anti-satellite systems targeting U.S. and allied satellites. I think that's a new statement. So there is some effort there. Could argue whether we could do more, but all of these things we have to be careful about. What would we, what's the intelligence gain loss on any of these issues?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Senator Fisher, if I may, the Defense Intelligence Agency just released a very extensive unclassified report about competition in space. I have not seen that level of communication in an unclassified sense in adversary thrust systems in a long time. It's a very good product, and I think has taken us a long way where we need to go in terms of communicating those threats.
Okay. I think it's extremely important without putting any of our people or our systems or our ways that we find information in jeopardy, to be able to get some kind of information out to the public, but also to certain think tanks who assume that they understand what's taking place in classified briefings, and they don't sometimes even come close to what is discussed in those briefings, and they make statements and generalizations, and they take positions on false information. But I think it would be especially helpful, as I said, for the public to understand threats that this country faces, and I believe our people would be very, very supportive of programs that are in place or that are being put in place to protect this country. Thank you.
I want to ask one crazy question here. With the need of speed in the future, has there been any thought of nuclear power in space?
Absolutely there is. NASA, I think, has a large portion of lead. If DOD is working on it, I haven't uncovered that piece yet. But roughly, there's a lot of advantages to some form of nuclear propulsion, long-duration missions, including manned missions, larger power source. And these are being looked at, but space nuclear propulsion is an expensive thing to look at and do safely and practice, but it is being worked. I think NASA has the lead.
Yes, Senator, recent national space policy has reinvigorated the look at nuclear power for electrical power generation and for nuclear propulsion. In fact, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has a nuclear propulsion research prototyping activity going on. But in terms of NASA is looking at potential nuclear power for use for moon basing. We are absolutely looking at it for propulsion and power generation on orbit going forward.
If we're going to do any planet hopping, getting there a lot quicker is going to make it in the future. Star Trek and all that stuff. I've got one company my NSA told me about, ESO Defense Systems. They've got a low-cost method of removing space debris. You ever heard of them out of Huntsville?
Senator, I have not. Specifically, I will tell you that our SpaceWorks, our innovative engine for space activities in a project called Orbital Prime, just put out a call for research activities and proposals. Recently awarded 125 different initiative contracts to go forward. It's very possible, I don't know for sure, it's very possible they're one of those companies, but it's specifically focused on that. Young, innovative, early companies looking for ways to help us with the debris problem. It's very possible they're part of that, but unfortunately I can't tell you for sure that's the case.
It's a good idea, commercially doing it, making money out of it. We can send those names to Russia and China so they can clean up their mess as we go.
Yes, sir.
So thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kramer, any additional questions? Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Been a very informative hearing. I appreciate your testimony today. And as I say, I want to reiterate what both Senator Fisher and I and Senator Rounds mentioned. Any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, desires in terms of the National Defense Act, get them to us in a very short order. Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.